My name is Christian Anderson, and I am with FSM, which is a local arts journal here in Appleton, Wisconsin. We cover the arts in Appleton, the arts being fine art, dance, music, etc. We are really excited to be hosting an online talk with Chris Cornelius. Chris is a architect, as well as a designer and kind of an activist. He's a part of the Oneida Nation, and we'll introduce him in a second. But first, I wanted to thank some folks that always sponsor our talks: Valley Academy for the Arts in Neenah, the Trout Museum of Art in Appleton, Mud and Prince in Appleton, and also all of our Patreon supporters that help us out with the paper. And then Katerina, the co-creator of the FSM, would like to thank some people also.
Yep, one sec. I would like to do a land acknowledgement. Currently, FSM is located on ancestral homelands of the Menominee Nations. Currently, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations in Wisconsin. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land throughout the generations and pay respects to their elders, past and present.
Thanks, Kat.
Yeah.
So before we start with the conversation, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be monitoring the chat. And if you have any questions of Chris that you'd like to ask directly, type them in the chat. One of our members of FSM, Chloe Allen, she'll be watching the chat, and near the end of our conversation, she'll be able to unmute you and you could ask Chris something directly. But I just wanted to first talk about Chris a little bit, which is always a real, I don't know, might be an uncomfortable thing, but maybe not. So Chris Cornelius, he's a citizen of the United Nation of Wisconsin, and he focuses research and practice on the architectural translation of culture, in particular, American Indian culture. He's a founding principal of Studio Indigenous. It's a design and counseling practice serving American Indian clients. He served as a cultural consultant and design collaborator with Antoine Predock on the Indian Community School of Milwaukee, which is something we'll be talking about tonight. ICS won the AIA Design Excellence Award from the Committee on Architecture for Education. Chris holds a Master of Architecture Design degree from the University of Virginia and a Bachelor of Science in Architectural Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And he's previously taught at the University of Virginia. Chris has won a number of awards for his work, such as he received the inaugural J. Irwin and Xenia S. Miller Prize. And then other awards include an Artist in Residence Fellowship for the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian Institution, and then multiple wins in the Ken Roberts Architectural Delineation Competition. He's currently teaching at, sorry, I'm letting someone in. He's an assistant professor for spring 2021 at Yale, and I think that might be where he's joining us from right now.
I'm in Milwaukee.
Oh, you're in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
That was actually one of our questions. Are you doing things virtual? Or are you actually?
Yeah, everything's virtual for me this semester. So.
Oh, okay. How is that working out for you?
It's good.
Yeah, wonderful. And you're teaching advanced graduate design studio focused on housing indigenous communities, correct?
Yep.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us, Chris. And I think if you don't mind giving us just a quick background about maybe some of the work that you do. Like I said, I do have some images. If there's something that you in particular wanted me to pull up, we certainly can go with that too.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I don't necessarily fit the sort of typical role of architect. I was educated as an architect and have always used art as part of my process. And I think the artist in residence at the National Museum of the American Indian was like one of the first things I got shortly after graduate school, and really started to think about how I was translating my culture, not only as an architect, as a spatial thing, but how was I going to represent that visually. And then when I received the Miller Prize, that was the first time I did an installation. I wanted to use that installation as a physical land acknowledgement. And I've done a few since. And I have been finding that my work has resonance in both the architecture profession and in art. My work has been exhibited. I won the Knoll Fellowship as well 2 years ago. So I try to, for me, I educate architects, and it's my profession, but I like to think of myself as just a designer, really, as someone that's doing creative work. And so I have certainly affinities with both fields. But I, want to be able to translate the work into spatial experiences through buildings. I think particularly contemporary architecture for indigenous people. What should we really be thinking about? What do those things look like? I don't particularly use indigenous forms per se, like dwelling forms and things like that. I don't try to replicate those. What I try to do is to understand how they work, what were the sort of parts and materials, how did the culture sort of see those structures, and how am I going to translate those into contemporary things and spaces. So my work is really kind of I'm trying to continue to do that. The Indian Community School, I would say, is probably the best example of having done that. That's the project that I started my practice with in 2003. They're still a client of mine. I'm going on 18 years with them. It's been a fantastic relationship. But I have tried to see my work too as a kind of activist. Like, how can I push an indigenous agenda? How can I make people aware of indigenous issues with physical artifacts and with my drawings and models and things that get exhibited? I try to use those things to bring up indigenous issues and things that have kind of always been an issue with the relationship between the United States government, for instance, and indigenous people. I think architecture can have a role in that. I don't think that that's just a sort of political, legal thing, because it's tied to the land, right? And I think that architecture is a way that we reconcile ourselves as human beings with the land. We can do that through architecture. So that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of how I think and work. But yeah.
Yeah. When you're talking about it makes me think about the project, and I don't know if it's a proposed project or something that you are actively working with, but when you bring up the more activist side, it really reminds me of what you were talking about with the Alcatraz project. Is that maybe something that you would be willing to talk about, and how maybe that relates to what you're saying? And I do have some images regarding that, if that's helpful.
Sure, you can pull them up. I can talk about that too. So that project started it was a research grant that I applied for and received from UWM. So I was really kind of interested in this idea that this occupation happened from November of 1969 to June of 1971. So almost 2 years. And this was after Alcatraz was decommissioned as a prison and was in the federal land surplus. And so the people that occupied the island was really students from the University of San Francisco, indigenous students. They did that because the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the Lakota people, in that treaty, the U.S. government said that any land that we deem a surplus, you can have it. And so that's why they occupied the island. They negotiated with President Nixon and Governor Reagan to take the island, but they didn't want it for political or economic gain. What they really wanted was to make a Native university, Native cultural center, Native ecological center. So in this grant proposal, I wrote that I wrote the sort of supposition that they got what they wanted, and I was going to design a Native university that was going to occupy the island, would sort of co-occupy it as a sort of national park. And this is really when I started to think of myself as having an activist role. I think that I really got into the complexities of everything culturally, politically, because the issues were still relevant today. And that's how these drawings kind of came about, is like, how was I going to draw all of these cultural complexities? And part of the way that I work is that drawing is really important to me. And I feel like as architects, we often take this position where we think of the design or the object or whatever it is, and then we represent that. It's, for me, I feel like we kind of cognitively shortcut ourselves as designers. Like, we're not letting in all of the creative material. I think there's a reciprocity between the way that we represent the thing and the thing itself. And so that has changed the way that I've drawn. And these drawings represent that process, because I was really like, how am I going to show all of the complexities of this landscape, the form of the land, the whole history of Alcatraz, because it's been, it's had many histories even before it was a prison. And how was I going to begin to think about how was I drawing these cultural things, right? And how they related to indigenous people. Right. So that's when I started to really think, like, when I talk about these drawings, I need to really be embedding things in them, right? Like, so when I show Chaco Canyon, one, I show it as to scale, meaning that the thing can fit on Alcatraz Island. But two, it allows me the ability to talk about the idea that we, as architects, even in architectural history, we don't talk about it. It doesn't show up in our architectural history, which is sort of dumbfounding to me. Like, why aren't we talking about how complex a masonry structure that this is? This rivaled what the Romans were doing, and there's just no way they could have known, right? There's no way that they could have ever communicated with one another. Really sophisticated structure. We don't talk about the first cities being indigenous dwellings. We don't talk about like places like Cahokia or Acoma Pueblo. We don't talk about the Pueblos as being the first multi-story buildings in this country. We don't talk about the whole sort of systems of infrastructure that were embedded in those cities. And so I wanted to embed that into these drawings as well. So in the sort of process of, like, when it came into my brain, I would put it in the drawing. I feel like I'm not going to parse out or edit out things. The drawings are thematic. This one happens to be about territory. So that's why you see some graffiti in it, because that's how they claimed the territories on the island. The graffiti was really important. And so I've used it as a way to, in the sort of beginnings of the project is ongoing. Eventually I want to kind of finish designing this university, and people have asked me to write books about indigenous architecture, and I felt like the best way to, so eventually hopefully I'll write a book that's based on this project. But for me, I have to design the project and then talk about how I've developed it. Mm-hmm. And I hope to do that, to be able to explain how I think about indigenous architecture. So when I lecture and I show images, even like this one, I index this image in the drawing itself with the date, and it's the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I make the very distinct point that what we're looking at is, this is the U.S. government, this is the United States Army, and this is how they treated indigenous people. On that day, they massacred over 300 indigenous people, unarmed. They were just dancing. And most of that 300 people, most of them were women and children. The men were out in the field fighting the rest of the army, and encroaching on their land. And so this idea or notion of this is how our sort of history of relationship between the U.S. government and indigenous people has kind of always been. And it's not until we begin to acknowledge this as genocide And it's not until we begin to acknowledge this as our history that we can even approach anything close to reconciliation. We really need to have these discussions, right? We have to have some difficult discussions about some of these things that are not that far from our history, right? This is, this is 2 generations for me. This is like my great grandparents' generation that when this happened. So this is not that far. Now, the bigger complexity for me politically and as an activist is when they approved the Dakota Access Pipeline, they didn't acknowledge the archaeological reports that said that this is what's in the land. People are buried in that landscape. It's not just about contaminating the water, which that thing is likely to do, but it's also about the fact that they want to run a pipeline through the ground and through this kind of territory, right? This is actually very near there. So for me, I think that this is important. I don't put the image in the drawing, but I index the date, and so I have to figure out how am I going to balance these like complex issues and other sort of formal strategies for making things as a designer. And so I draw in this really sort of complex way. I'm drawing on the front and back of drafting Mylar, different colors, stickers, numbers. Again, I'm trying not to like censor these things. If it creatively comes in and fits the theme, then I put it in the drawing. And I actually teach my students kind of how to draw like this. I've developed a sort of system for administering this kind of drawing because I can't just show them these drawings and say, produce this. But I have a whole sort of like 2-week process, multi-week process sometimes to show them how to kind of draw this, because I think it's a useful tool for us as designers when we're dealing with bigger issues. And I like to teach studios about other cultures. And one of the studios I teach is about hip hop and seeing hip hop as a culture. How do we begin to translate that? And I'm doing that now with my Yale students. We're on indigenous housing. We're working on housing proposals in a community in Manitoba, just north of Winnipeg. It's rather isolated, but we're dealing with some of these issues and using it to examine that culture and how indigenous people should be housed, right? I think that's one of the sort of things that we need to address, because one of the problems with it is that funding isn't necessarily the problem. There seems to be plenty of funding. It's just like seeing it as the apparatus of colonization, right? Because housing in this country, for most people, is a way to accumulate middle class wealth, right? Like this idea of I have a mortgage, I got a job, I'm paying my mortgage, I'm building wealth, and I sell this house, and when I retire or I die, my children get this wealth. That's not, and plus I own the land that it sits on, right? And I pay taxes on that. In indigenous communities, that doesn't happen. There has to be a different model. So we're looking at some of those issues too. So in that way, I try to I'm teaching 10 non-indigenous Ivy League students about indigeneity and how do we kind of address these issues? How do we tackle them? And that's kind of where we're at now in the semester. They're developing proposals for how to do that.
And you're really going beyond just how does housing fix some of these larger issues, correct? I mean, you're thinking more history, and you're thinking about using almost architecture and design and the storytelling that you're doing to almost decolonize some of what's happened, correct?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm like, there are many things, but one of the things that is a recurring theme for me in my work is the trickster. Like I've done 2 installations based on the trickster now. And I've really started to think about the role of that character, I'll call it, for lack of a better term, in indigenous storytelling. And the trickster model is not like exclusive to indigeneity, right? It shows up in others, like in Norse mythology, Loki is a trickster, basically. But the idea here is that could we, because to me it's an interesting sort of thing, like it's completely sort of invented by the storyteller. And usually that trickster is associated with an animal. Sometimes it's some sort of weird phenomena or creature or something else. But so when I did this installation, I really wanted to like, okay, well, I'm going to forget about form and program in architecture, and I'm just going to build this thing. And then I'm going to let the children that come to this garden, Bookworm Gardens in Sheboygan, let them tell a story about what it is. You know, let them sort of invent the story, because that's really what it's about. It's about like, how did this thing get here? You know, I talked to this young woman, she was like, she didn't know I was building it, but she was like, well, this looks like it's from a movie, or it's like animals came first and then people. And I was thinking to myself, you get it. Like, that's exactly what it is. So I think that when I go back to housing and think about being a trickster, I think it's about like really flipping the system on its head and leveraging indigenous sovereignty, for instance, and then leveraging things that are decolonizing things like building codes. Building codes are colonization, just period, right? There's just ways of getting people to live the same way. Now, I'm not suggesting that we would build anything that's unsafe. What I am suggesting is that we write building codes through an indigenous lens. We write them as responsibilities, right? We write them about all of the inhabitants of the landscape. We don't just write them about like, you need this kind of foundation, so whatever performance. You write it as, you could even write it as a story. And indigenous people have sovereignty on lands that they're, you know, as a reservation. So when I've done projects for my own tribe on the Oneida Reservation, when I worked for other firms and even for my own firm, when we submit the drawings to the state for review, I've had this instance several times, and the state says, well, we don't have to review it because you don't have to follow the codes, right? There's sovereignty there. Because you can enforce the codes that you want or not. But so my students are like, what sort of housing codes can we like work on that are more like the trickster, that are really just about indigeneity, and they're about telling stories, and they're about how do we, fulfill, what standards do we follow and which ones do we not? Which ones do we subvert? Do we even need property lines if it's on a reservation boundary? If the land is held in trust and it's held by all of the people, and you're basically kind of leasing the land, how do we sort of flip that on its head?
Right.
Yeah.
Let's see. Someone popped into with a question. Let me, Chloe, I'm not sure if you have the ability to unmute this person. Maybe I'll give it a try here, if that's all right. Charity had brought something up here. And I'm going to try to unmute you. Charity? Maybe? Charity? So she wrote indigenous architecture plus contemporary indigenous dwelling plus indigenous non-ownership culture plus climate change equals what? Indigenous
Better world.
Yeah, right.
So that's that's what it's about for me. Because too, like this idea of sustainability, let's just deal with the climate change issue.
Yeah.
We all know that we're in the terminal velocity, right? We're like, the planet is beyond repair. We can only slow down that decay at this point, right? And I believe that indigenous people have always known that this was the problem, that the human interaction with the world is, we can't extract more than the earth can provide, right? That's just an unsustainable future. So, and I think there's also a misconception about indigenous people, meaning like when Europeans came here, that this wasn't just a wild place. Like this was like this was highly managed. The landscapes were highly managed. It's not that there weren't forest fires in California until recently. There's just more. So indigenous people knew how to control forest fires, right? That we were selectively burning prairies and reforesting areas and harvesting wood in the right way. And like, but all of this sort of changed because of this sort of extraction culture that came along with industrialization and capitalism sort of accelerated all of that. But I think that now if we started to go back to thinking about what were these practices that were happening tens of thousands of years ago, can we start to help change that? And you know, there are examples of that. The Menominee Reservation is one of them. When you look at a satellite photo of Wisconsin, you see the rectangle of the Menominee Reservation. It almost looks like it's photoshopped. It's so dense and so green. That's because they've always sustainably harvested that land. It is one of the highest standards in the world for forestry. You know, people come from all over the world to study it. And so if we use these as models, this is how we can begin to think about how do we slow these things down, right? Because we have to implement them at a larger scale. So in architecture, there's like LEED, you may have heard of LEED, platinum, gold, silver, sort of building rating systems that are all sort of like checklists and like things and standards. But for me, I like to think about those things as, what if we thought about them as cultural values? And what if we thought of buildings as if we were related to them, that they're part of all of our relations, that buildings are part of these inhabitants in the landscape. They're not there to just be extractive things that we occupy for 25 or 30 years, tear down and put in a landfill. What if we thought about them like, okay, what is the life of this thing after it's a school? Or, you know, when it's no longer even an industrial building, how do we think about that?
Yeah.
And so for me, I'm trying to think about all of these things in this, because if you begin to examine indigenous culture, it's not one where it's just these sort of separate things. Like all of these things are interconnected. Even architecture, right? We didn't talk about architecture as indigenous people because we never separated other things. We didn't separate politics and religion and agriculture and arts. You know, we never separated all of those things. That was just part of our existence. So I think now is a time to kind of examine those things and try to figure out like how do we apply them now to the 21st century.
And that kind of mirrors how you work, it seems like, when you're trying to balance the arts and design and architecture and stories and continuity with a people and a history. You aren't thinking about how non-Indigenous people might think of just, I'm going to solve this issue and this is how I'm going to focus, but instead you're thinking, I don't even know how you get started on your projects, to be honest, Chris. If it is a matter of, am I going to investigate a history? Am I going to solve a question or a need that my client has offered? Because what you work with has so many layers. How do you even start that process?
You know, I really like to just engage people, and not in ways like a typical architect would. Like I wouldn't just like sit down and say, well, just tell me what is it you want, and then like write that down. What I've found is that people will you'll eventually get the answers you want if you're engaging people.
Yeah.
And so for instance, with the Indian Community School, it's a huge project. We've got 11 tribes, 5 different cultural groups that all have to be sort of represented in this building, because it's not for one tribe, it's not just for one culture. And how do we translate that? So we started to kind of like meeting myself and Antoine Predock. I tried to explain to him like this idea, this was the perfect image. So I started to explain to him like all of these things can't be delaminated. This is like a series of reciprocities. And so this graphic that I created actually represents, we listed out like 30, 40, maybe actually more, to be honest, probably as close to 100 different sort of cultural things. We decided to make images for about 32 of them. we felt were the most important. And because they were cultural values like dance and cycles of the moon, this one is about community. So we started to apply those to the spaces. So we never called it the lobby, we call it community. We didn't call it the theater, we call it drum. There's burrowing, oral tradition, music, intergenerational, like those things are embedded in that. So we created these like collage like graphics to say this is all of those things are embedded in the project. So the process for me isn't like always the same for projects. It's really about like, how do I get these sort of big ideas, and then what is the sort of story that I want to tell with this one project? Because I think one of the mistakes that designers make, even other indigenous architects, when you're doing a project for a tribe or a nation or whatever, you can't encapsulate the whole culture in one building. It's just not going to work. So you have to figure out what is that story, and that's what I try to do. And it's through engaging people that I start to really realize what that story is. What is the thing that's going to sort of resonate most with people? For that project, it's the names. Some of these, things been open for 14 years, going on 14 years, and they still call them, still called the drum, still called community. We never called the place that they eat the cafeteria. We removed all those sort of institutional names from the school. It's called Feast, and that's where they go. And there's a classroom called Turtle. That's where they go. And it's not like whatever 147 or something like that. They have names. The classrooms have names. So students are identifying with those cultural sort of names. And then those names are tied to stories that they're told, languages that they learn, and other cultural things that they're learning within it. So, and it was important to us to kind of like almost be abstract about these things, because in indigenous storytelling, it's up to the listener to figure out what is going on in the story and what lessons are to be learned. It's not up to the storyteller to just tell us what the rules and ways of conducting yourself should be. It's this sort of like wonderful ambiguity that's in it. So I like to work in that way. So that's why the sort of visuals are this sort of multi-layered thing that we're visually seeing many things at once. We're seeing migration patterns, we're seeing wind patterns, we're seeing drum resonance, we're seeing orientation, oral tradition, like all of that stuff is embedded in this one graphic.
Right. And then this is the actual school, and it's in Franklin, right?
Yep.
So outside of Milwaukee.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
is it middle school and high school? Is that
it's K4 through 8.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Wow. What a beautiful building for them.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Mm-hmm. It's the student entrance. We call that migration. It's a big event that happens every day in the morning and the afternoon when students are coming in and out of school.
So then the school, this entity is teaching these kids some cultural values just through the being of the piece itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the spaces have names. The building has its own sort of mythology, and it's that I feel like it has particular resonance with these students because they see themselves in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, someone said that to me recently, like when they at the school, they said like, well, when they bring other people through the building, they can always see themselves in it. They can always see different cultural aspects. These tree columns are from the Menominee Forest, and they were harvested through a ceremony. They gave their lives to the school. They're white pines. Some of them are over 300 years old. They hold stories, these trees, right? They hold stories of storms and adversity that are pre-European contact. And so those trees are in there to tell those stories.
Yeah.
It just matters how you listen, right? How you learn. This was a piece that I did on the campus for them too. That was it's basically just a room for them to change for the sweat lodge ceremony. So I started to think, well, I'm putting this thing next to the ceremonial thing, and how can I make it look as if it had always been there? So I drew the inspiration from these large stones. These large stones were excavated during the making of the building, so we kind of kept them all on the site. But so I started to think about, well, could I make this thing like a huge stone? It's faceted and it's kind of gray and blends in with the landscape. People go in, they change their clothes, that are appropriate for the sweat lodge, and then when they come back out, they can use it to change back into their kind of street clothes. So it's sort of transformational, right? It's part of that process of the ceremony.
Kat, did you have any questions, or Chloe, that you might want to ask Chris at this point?
I
Go
mean,
for it, Chloe.
I definitely have questions. There were two that I was kind of interested in the most. First of all, I had listened to a podcast that you did with Marquette, and you had talked about your grandmother briefly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for those who don't know, there's a popular trickster narrative going through like Anishinaabe culture, and part of that is very closely tied to the trickster's grandmother. And so I was just kind of curious, what your grandmother's name was and what it was about her that I think you mentioned it kind of changed how you viewed yourself and she knew you. I live with my grandma, so I just was kind of curious what you'd have to say about that.
Yeah. My my grandmother's really important to me. And she, I would say, is probably like my deepest connection to the culture. So I learned about her history growing up, and that history was not great in the sense that she was basically taken from her home and put into a boarding school, and she didn't speak English until she was like almost 13 years old or something like that. And so she was in the school, the way that they sort of got rid of the language was to beat students that spoke the language. So I knew that was her history. And because of that, she spoke fluently, right? That was her first language. And so, but she wouldn't teach us the language. She, one, I think it was too kind of traumatic for her. But the other thing is that she said, you have to live the language. So I can't just teach it to you as a sort of lesson. So she didn't teach us much, but she told me things about my own culture, like things that I won't mention specifics here, but things that are like almost ceremonial that had a lot to do with who I am today and how I became an architect, even to be honest. With between her and my father, who was her son, they decided that this was a thing that they kind of wanted me to do, but they couldn't tell me that until I decided to do it on my own. The other thing that was really important, I can't remember if I mentioned this in the podcast, but growing up, I was like super introverted. I'm like painfully introverted. Like it would be very difficult for me to do this, like to even talk about anything and to talk to strangers. I feel like she understood that about me. She knew that I was just different in that particular way. And even when I was in high school, one of the things that I always did with her was like, I drove her to the grocery store and like helped her do her shopping and drove her home. And I wouldn't say anything because I was just like so introverted. But I felt like she knew exactly how to deal with me personally. But I always think about her because of that, right? Like has a really sort of important aspect to that part of not just my culture, but who I am and how I kind of became what I am. Unfortunately, she passed before I had even started. I mean, I was in architecture school, I think, when she passed, but she didn't get to see any like projects that I had done yet. But I feel like that was like a really sort of important thing in my life, and is always, I always kind of think about that as well. So she, when I was a kid, she'd tell me these stories too, like trickster stories and other sorts of stories. And the thing about that is, like, when you're a kid, they're like entertaining. You don't really like know how embedded they are with cultural things. And I think these things, the stories they're also embedded with like science and technology and, history and other sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of podcasts, I was listening to one. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts in this pandemic, too many of them. And there was one where they were interviewing Jeffrey Gibson. For those who don't know, he's a First Nation artist. He's out in New York City right now. I assume he's still out in New York. He was for a while. He had a studio there. He talked about that when he was starting, he had a concern about using what seemed like traditional objects. Yeah, as he didn't want to become that kind of he was worried it might be a cliche to use those sorts of things. Did you feel anything like that, Chris, when you were saying, I'm going to start, exploring culture through architecture? Did you ever worry that I don't want to be labeled as that I'm the indigenous architect? And how did you resolve that?
Yeah, that was something I like figured out like really quickly, to be honest. So when between the time I graduated undergrad and went to grad school, I worked at an office here in Milwaukee and had done a couple of projects for my own tribe, and I was the project designer on them. And I designed a building, I put the sort of Hiawatha belt thing on the roof or whatever. You'll never find it in my portfolio somewhere, but that thing, like, I realized, okay, there has to be a better way to do this. Like, I can't just like indigenize a building by putting stuff on it, like by putting iconography on it or making a school that looks like a turtle, which is there. So that was the one thing that I kind of pushed against. Okay, I said early on, these are the things I'm not going to do. I'm not going to make a turtle building, and I'm not going to make a regular building with just applying things on it. How can I make that stuff experiential? So and also the other thing is, like, it has always been important to me to be a good architect first. Like, I didn't, I went to UVA for grad school. There weren't any indigenous professors there, but I knew I was going to do a thesis project where I was translating my culture. I just needed to go to the best school that would help me try to figure that out. And I feel like I did. And they were very receptive to that, very receptive to that, and really sort of profoundly affected me in that way. I think that's still important. I tell, the young indigenous architects that I know that are in school or recently graduated, the same thing. Like, you can't just be in that 1% lane. You can't just do that, because it's just too easy for the rest of society to dismiss it. When you're 1% of the population, it's just easy to kind of dismiss that. If you're good and you want to be a good architect and you want to be in the discussion of the entire discipline, then you have to figure out how to get into that discipline. That's always been important to me, right? So this is how I got a professorship at Yale. This is, I didn't like apply for it. I was, Deborah Burke, the dean, wanted to talk to me about it, and she, gave me this position. So I think that that's the way to go. I think that that's the way to go, because I look at people like Douglas Cardinal, right? He was someone that, he's still practicing, but he figured it out. He got respect from the rest of the profession because he was doing his own thing. He wasn't just the indigenous architect. He was just trying to do great architecture for indigenous people and for non-indigenous people. And right now, I would say most of my clients are non-indigenous. More than a big majority are non-indigenous people that want me to do indigenous things. And so I feel like that's important. And again, for me to have this conversation and decolonize, I have to be in the system. I have to do it from the outside or inside. I can't just be outside throwing sticks at it. You know, that's not going to work.
Definitely. Is the architect that you mentioned, is he the one? I was watching a lot of videos. Is he the one that had kind of the curved architecture to his shapes to his work, right?
Yeah, he did the National Museum of the American Indian in DC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cap, did you have any questions that you'd like to ask Chris?
No, I'm just like soaking it all in. I feel like all the questions I had, and that really is just like, you know, how do you integrate your generational history into your work without, you know, throwing it in someone's face and say, take it. And you're answering all of that. And just the way that you do it is so incredibly intricate that my mind's blown right now a little bit. So
do you see your work about preservation or reclamation?
Both of those terms suggest a existing condition that is either been claimed or is in need of preservation. I'm a futurist.
Yeah.
I'm not either of those things, to be honest. I don't like what I'm trying to do is to say, okay, well, I'm in this generation. And if I'm thinking about the 7 generations before me and the 7 generations behind me, the culture hasn't changed and will not change. But what I'm creating today as a building is going to be the artifact for that 7th generation. When they look back to, 2021, what is it that I have produced that they say, wow, that's new? It's not the wigwam, teepee, longhouse, whatever. Like those things were things, but what is it today? Like what should, and I'm going to be addressing this question myself in my own work. What is housing? What should housing be like today? Like what, if we're not doing the HUD house thing anymore, what is that thing going to look like?
Yeah.
I think indigeneity has always been about the future. Even Douglas Cardinal said this too, like, and I agree that our elders' teachings, we misconceive as teachings about the past when they're actually teachings about the future. Like, what are we going to do? What should we be doing in the future?
Yeah. Chloe, you had a question, right?
Yeah, and I think this perfectly segues into it because one of the most fascinating things to me about Chris's work as a much, younger, earlier in my career Indigenous artist is the fact that there's this central focus instead on the future, because I think it's really easy to get caught up in the past. We see one of those images like the mass grave at Wounded Knee, and that's like a week of misery,
Wow.
to think about how heavy that situation is. And I think it's very easy to get stuck there and not look into the future. And I think that the way, kind of tying into what Kat was saying, the way that you're working that in is really fascinating to me. And has kind of blown the top off my mind in how I think about my own practice and how to, avoid commodifying being Potawatomi or being Oneida or what have you. And so I had a question for you then. What do you think about the Indigenous presence in academia? Because I know that you're teaching at Yale right now, and we could all probably say it's probably not the most Indigenous environment, even though they have a very celebrated Native Studies program. It's pretty hard to go to school, especially for Indigenous families. I'm going to be the first grad from a 4-year college from my family. So what's your opinion, operating on that inside? Do you think that it's valid for people to try to go to school, even with the cost and the hurdles that are faced? Or any thoughts along those lines, kind of advice-wise?
Yeah, I think that, I have found education to be emancipating. It has never been easy. It was never easy for me as a student. At all. it took me more than 4 years to graduate undergrad, which I think is true for a lot of indigenous people. It's just like, when I left the reservation, Oneida was like, there was no gaming, so there was no like income. There was like nothing. And so when I said, okay, I'm going to be an architect, I'm going to go to Milwaukee and study architecture, I was like, people were like, well, what are you doing that? Like, I studied abroad because I left the reservation. I went to Milwaukee, right? So it's challenging. So you have to be up for the challenge. And not everyone is, but if you are up for the challenge, I think we kind of owe it to everyone else to be able to make an impact in that situation, right? So for me right now, what I'm trying to do is to have these discussions about just the way that we teach architecture to young architects, the ways that we have never really questioned what we call the canon of architecture. We never have talked about like who developed that canon and why aren't we looking at certain things? And it's not just the indigenous architecture that I'm, arguing for. Is like, let's look at world things. Like let's start to think about those things much broader. So I do think that when you are indigenous and you are either in academia or you're part of the academia machine, you kind of should try to carve your own path within that, right? As students, I don't think that you have to like feel overly compelled to like apply your culture to what you're studying. However, I think that I've always like trying to draw the parallels. Like, what are the parallels between these two things? So one of the things I talk about in my lectures and that has recently come on, recently meaning in the past year and a half or so, come on my radar is this book by George Manuel called The Fourth World, which was out of print for a long time. And George Manuel was an indigenous activist in Canada. Like he's like the indigenous activist. He passed away, I don't know how long ago, but in this book, what he's suggesting is that there is a fourth world. And in that world, indigenous people and everyone else are equal, like really equal. And he's not saying that it's below the third world. He's saying get rid of that hierarchy and let's stop competing with the first world of imperialism and colonization. Let's erase all of that. Let's just forget it and say, okay, this is the fourth world. This is a new world. This is how it works. And so what he uses in the book is the 2-row wampum belt by the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, which is just 2 rows of dark beads, but they actually symbolize 2 canoes, right? It's the indigenous canoe and it's the non-indigenous canoe. And that's how I always see myself. Like I can straddle both those canoes, meaning I can be in academia and I can be indigenous. The waters might get rough. So I got to pick one of the canoes to sit in. And sometimes I pick the non-indigenous canoe, sometimes, which is academia. Sometimes I pick the indigenous canoe where I want to make a statement about something. But I'm trying to straddle both those things. So if I'm learning something about European, Eurocentric ways of seeing architecture, I'm drawing a parallel between the indigenous architecture. If I'm learning about architectural theory in grad school, I wrote an entire paper about how I would apply that to my own culture. I'm not trying to separate those two things. I'm not trying to say one's better than the other. I'm trying to always bring those things parallel. So I think as indigenous students, don't feel like you have to like get these canoes to like cross, but to get them to run parallel, right? How are you going to apply the things that you're learning and what you're doing? And that might come while you're in school, it might come after, but I think we kind of owe it to ourselves to say, okay, there are 2 canoes, there are 2 parallel worlds that we're sort of working within, and we need to kind of do that. And it is hard because I was the first 2 in my family to go to college. I was like one of maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 people that went to college. My high school class was probably about 20% indigenous, but and I'm pretty sure I'm the only one that's a professor now. But I think that when you're in that position, you got to row a little harder, right? Like you got to work a little bit harder. I often think of it as running up a down escalator. You have to run faster than the thing's going down on you, right? In order to make any progress. If you go the same speed, you're never going to get anywhere. It's a little bit harder. But I think that it's put me in a position where I feel like I can say something about these issues, you know?
Yeah, it brings to mind that that Toni Morrison quote where she talks about if you have the ability to open the door, once you get in the door yourself, you got to leave it open for the people coming.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which I think is one of the, I'll just kind of go on another tangent, but I think is one of the things, like people are really, there's a reckoning right now, right? Like we're having a social justice reckoning. And I'm a little afraid that we might overcorrect a little bit, meaning like we might go, okay, diversity, equity, inclusion is really important to all of us. Well, it should be, but let's hold on a second. Let's like stop saying it so much and let's start doing something about it. We have to do something about it. And this is the analogy that I've come up with in my mind. If there is a boat of people that represent everyone in the, let's say, the United States, that boat capsizes and people are in the water. Some people can swim, some people can't. We have to be able to, if we're have the ability to be able to swim and get on the boat, if that's higher education, let's use that as the analogy. We have to reach the other people. We might have to jump back in the water to get them. We can't just like stay in the boat and say, well, there's a boat here. There's a scholarship. Come on and apply. That's not enough. We have to go and get these people in their communities to tell them like you're worthy of higher education, right? You're worthy of having a degree. You're worthy of being a lawyer, a doctor, an architect, sociologist, whatever it is you want to be. You're worthy of doing that. So we have to be able to take that step further and say, okay, how are we going to be able to do that? One of the ways is like by seeing indigenous people in those positions, right? To see an indigenous professor of architecture. That's one of the ways to be able to do that, to get other indigenous people into the academia or even into the profession. You don't have to be an academic, I don't think, but if you want to be in the profession, to see people
Chris,
like you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Charity Meyer, and you kind of answered some of the question with your talk about the fourth world.
Mm-hmm.
But so I have a background. I'm an older student. In my culture, my upbringing, my grandparents came from all over the world. I do have indigenous blood in me, but it's not a culture that I learned. I was very poor growing up. My parents were very strictly religious, and we moved all over the Midwest. And I picked up regionalisms and Christianity, and I was so poor I didn't know what to do. So I joined the military, and I learned Persian Farsi, what they speak in Iran, and I traveled the world. And I come back after all of these experiences, and I reject my culture of heritage. Like I rejected everything about patriarchy, everything about all the ways that I was disempowered through what I was raised with. It was like, there is a verse in the Bible that says children are no better than slaves. And that's literally how I was raised. I was the oldest female in this household. So as an older student who, had some suffering that happened in the military, all the bad things, when I do my research, when I look, when I am interested in different cultures, and now I'm an art student, and I just bought a house, and I know that that's, questionable, but I have land now that I want to be a good steward of.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do my art, I find when I learn about First Peoples and indigenous cultures, there's so much more that makes sense to me about the judiciousness of that culture versus what I was raised with. And whereas some people would be able to change their religion to Jewishness or to Catholicism or whatever through an educational system, there's not really anything like that in place for me if I am interested in learning more about indigenous populations or using those modalities in my own creativity and life. So what would you say to someone like me on the other side of it? Because it gets really tricky talking about my desire to be more indigenous, and I am American. So am I not Native American? And that's a very touchy topic to ask, because I was born here and I was born in the culture, and that's not as beautiful as we are told it was once upon a time. But I can't say I'm not native to America.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but there are some people, and I agree sometimes, but that criticize the term Native American because you can't be native to something you preceded, right? You can't, like, that's why I like the term indigenous too, because when you say Native American, you're just like exclusively saying within the US boundary, when indigenous people, I include Canada, but it's just like there's no boundary there because our cultures are the same. I think that, well, if I'm understanding correctly your question, I think that if you have to be careful about appropriation, right? Like you have to be careful about like how are you appropriating sort of cultural ways of thinking. And I think the way to kind of get around that is to say, well, how does it apply to me personally? Like how does it apply to me, instead of co-opting something? Like how does it, for instance, like how does this notion of like us understanding that we are related to non-humans, and in indigenous culture, non-humans include stones. Like we see stones as living, we see the earth as our mother, we see the moon as our grandmother. Like how do I start to think about that, right? I might not, so if I were to use if I weren't indigenous, I would use those terms. That could be a form of appropriation. But if I started to really think about, just for my own way of living and being in the world, or even in my art, like I'm including animals in the art, like that's not necessarily in and of itself indigenous, right? So for me, it's just about how do you begin to translate those things for yourself? Like, what do they mean to you personally? And to be careful about the appropriation of indigenous things, and even symbols and iconography, but to be able to think about what does it mean to you as someone who's been around the world and had many experiences. I think that, if you're a good artist, you put yourself into the work, right? It's
Appropriation is very difficult to wrap my head around, because sometimes when I am drawing my own things just from my imagination, they will look very similar to tribal things. So how can I be honest with myself when there is this discussion about appropriation? Do I just quietly do my thing and just deal with any backlash I might get for appropriation?
I think that, I don't know, everyone has their own process, but I have certain things that if I'm do it, I don't show it. If I make something that looks like a teepee and I don't want someone saying that looks like a teepee, I'm not going to show it, right? It's just, you'll never see it. So it's not that I don't create things that would have some sort of other stereotypical meaning or association with them. It's just that I kind of always measure that against what I'm doing. I let it come out and then sort of edit afterwards. But that's where you have to be kind of careful about, within your own work, like how do you process that information, and how do you translate it?
Thanks, Charity, for that question. That's definitely important as we're thinking about how we navigate all of this social upheaval that we're facing with, and we want to do so much, and we want to be a part of things, and we just, it's a very good question you had, Charity. Thank you, Chris, for answering that. In respect for Chris's time, was there any other questions that you might have of him? Otherwise, we've had him for an hour, and I think it might have been his birthday yesterday, so he's probably tired for being out all night. Happy birthday,
Thank
Chris.
you. Thanks.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any questions? Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. As we grow as a community, and the reason for what we're doing with our organization, our journal, but this community is just trying to really understand what the arts can be and what can the arts be, what can the arts teach us, and how we can start to experience living on a higher level through thinking of and being intentional with what we do. And
Mhm.
so we really appreciate the time you took to talk to us, and thank you, Chris.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and
Thanks.
everyone have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.